My Zoom still has a thing that says you are in a practice session.
Yep, I'm about to let people in.
Okay.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's event on improving user agency in end-to-end encrypted systems. If that is in fact the panel or webinar that you're looking for, you are in the right place. If not, welcome. We hope you enjoy the conversation anyway. My name is Emma Alonso. I am the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Want to go over a few kind of housekeeping notes, but then we've got a really great set of panelists today that I can't wait for you to hear from. Sorry, my cat has joined the conference. First off, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. CDT is helping to put this event on along with the Stanford Internet Observatory and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Thanks especially to the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford for handling the tech and the invitations and everything for today's event. What we are here to talk about today is exactly what it says on the tin, improving user agency in the use of end-to-end encrypted messaging systems and other end-to-end encrypted communications. As all of you joining this call are probably no doubt aware, end-to-end encryption has been a huge topic in public policy conversations just in the past couple of months, but in fact for many decades in internet policy time. Just last week, we saw Global Encryption Day kind of encouraging users around the world to make the switch to end-to-end encrypted systems. And I think that kind of focus on what are users doing, what are users needing from this technology, what's working, what isn't, and what can really help people take better advantage of end-to-end encryption is really what we're here to talk about today. There are a lot of other conversations going on around encryption, whether it's law and policy proposals about introducing backdoors or really deep questions about how to combat some of the most atrocious content on the web when more communications are turning towards end-to-end encryption. We will probably touch on a lot of those different topics today, but our focus today really is all about user agency, and what do people need from these systems. So the format for today's event will be a conversation among our expert panelists that we have arranged here, but we do really want to hear from you all in attendance as well. There is a Zoom Q&A function that you can find clicking at the bottom of the screen. I see we've already got a couple of questions or attaboys added in there already. So please do use that function whenever you encounter or have a question during the event. We may try to work them into the regular flow of discussion, but we will definitely have specific time for audience Q&A and discussion towards the end of the event. And so with all of that out of the way, let me start introducing our amazing speakers today. And what I've asked for each of our speakers to do is to share with us, as just a little bit of opening framing, what is their key question or issue that they think of when they think of user agency and end-to-end encrypted communications. What is the problem that they are trying to solve? And so first, I will turn to John Callis from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. John, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. End-to-end communications to me, I have built end-to-end systems in the past, and I view that as something of a syntactic thing. It is how you construct the system so that only the participants in it know what's going on. This conversation that we're having right now, this webinar, could be end-to-end encryption. It isn't, but it could be. And if it were, though, it's being streamed to a number of people. We're also recording it to go up on the web later. So there is an aspect of the fact that it would be end-to-end encrypted that is so what, because it's going to be available to nearly everybody eventually. And much of what we talk about with user agency is about user experience. It's about what at one time was called community building and construction. It is how you want to have the people who are using the system to be able to deal with what goes on in it. And there are many things that are completely acceptable, but are not the raw communications. This is anything from a spell checker to filters like what Snapchat does. Snapchat has end-to-end encryption and it has these filters. These don't necessarily affect it, but how do we want to interact with everybody else who's on the internet? And many of these questions are kind of reaching ahead, where things that we built into our communication system ever since, the telephone, are under question right now. Like, should you automatically get a call from anybody in the world? Should we be allowed to call somebody just because we know their number? Amusingly, just this week, there was a news story about a hiker who didn't return back to camp and ignored the calls from potential rescuers because the hiker thought they were spam. And this, to me, is an evidence of we're in a broken world. That if you're going to be out on a hike and say, please stop bothering me because I'm lost, and it's the people trying to know if you're lost, then our modes of communication are broken. And thus, we're talking about how we fix these things and what we want our experiences to be, rather than the technical encryption bits of how you construct a system where only the participants know what's going on.
That's great. A lot to dig into there, but I want to bring everyone else into the conversation first. So next I will turn to Kate Dadamo, who is with an amazing advocate with Reframe Health and Justice, which is a collective that's committed to developing and delivering holistic harm reduction solutions to social injustices. So Kate, to you.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this conversation and for making it a fleshed out conversation. As you mentioned, my background is harm reduction, and really in particular harm reduction, community organizing and building with folks that trade sex and who are impacted by the sex trade. That means I've worked with sex workers who have plenty of options, sex workers who have very few options, and people who identify as victims of trafficking. And so my framework that I bring to this, and the reason why I think this conversation is important, is because my framework is the health and safety of everyone impacted by the sex trade, especially through the lens of anti-violence. And my question around technology is, what is the role that technology plays in either furthering that health and safety or hindering that health and safety? And so that's kind of the place that I approach all of these conversations from. And when we have these conversations, very often there is an assumption that everyone has shared values. And not only is that not true, I think it's fine for it not to be true. It's important for it not to be true. There should always be these tensions when we're developing platforms and solutions. We should always be having these conversations. And so beyond simply saying, what is the role of technology in improving the lives of marginalized people? The other piece that I really want to bring into this is that too often this is a dialogue that happens without a conversation about criminalization. And sometimes we'll have discussions about things like, democracy, abroad and what that means, and who has and the criminalization of activists in other countries. But very rarely are we talking about the impact of day-to-day criminalization and the way that that forces people out of public space, out of physical space, and very often into digital space in seeking that health and safety. And when we lose that, what also happens is that we envision the users of these platforms, we center users that look like the people who are having the conversation and making the policy. And very often that means that we lose the understanding of how and why people are accessing digital spaces and crafting and building and becoming pioneers in those digital spaces. And so that is the other kind of piece that I want to bring. Because of criminalization and day-to-day criminalization, the work that I do is often criminalized. Harm reduction for criminalized people often means trying to figure out how to weigh violence of the state against violence of the individual and making decisions to balance those two things. And because of criminalization, what we ask technology platforms to do, I understand, is very often take on a liability that impacts regulation, that impacts oversight, and that most importantly, unfortunately, impacts valuation of companies. And so while we're having that conversation, while we're arguing about that tension and trying to figure out the right balance, I recognize that I come to this question and with that value set of health and safety for criminalized people, recognizing that I am their problem to be solved because they don't want to take on my liability. And so, I'm really excited to discuss this because it is a really important conversation about the ways that technology has actually been instrumental in reducing violence, reducing trafficking, reducing exploitation, and creating additional options and creating additional space where people can access health and safety. And centering that is an incredibly important conversation that I'm really excited to have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Next, we'll bring in Rihanna Pfefferkorn with the Stanford Internet Observatory.
Thanks, Emma. So I think my interests when it comes to this particular conversation are both to go back to a question that has been dominating my thinking for much of this year, which is what are the options for providing a means of giving users more power over the privacy and the security and the safety of their conversations within and in encrypted spaces in a way that does not depend upon the provider having guaranteed access to the content of all their communications, even if it may have access to other information, such as metadata or information about the user's social graph or what have you, depending on what the particular product at issue is. And what are the other options besides that? How effective are they with respect to different types of abuse? And to what degree may they serve as almost a replacement for access to content, since that is no longer really as proactive of an option within encrypted spaces. I'm also interested, for purposes of our discussion today, in exploring, sort of building on what Kate was saying, what we actually mean when we're talking about user agency or user respect and empowerment and safety, because I think that, as Kate was saying, those words can mean different things to different people. And that agency by one person's standard might be, please block out all of the unwanted information that I might not want to see so that I don't have to deal with it. And for another person might mean, give me more control over and granular control over the conditions under which I choose to receive and send and share information with other people. And those are all, I think, design problems where services that operate at the scale of hundreds of millions or billions of people are trying to figure out one design that can be applicable to all of these different needs and interests and equities all at the same time. So I'm looking forward to exploring those questions today.
And then finally, I want to bring in my colleague from the Center for Democracy and Technology who runs our research program, Dhanaraj Thakur.
Great. Thank you, Aman. Hi, everyone. So as some of you may know, CDT has a long history in promoting strong end-to-end encrypted communications. I guess more recently then, the angle that I want to add here, basically build upon what others have said, is that there have been lots of discussions recently on how to improve content analysis and detection on end-to-end encrypted platforms, particularly to address abusive or unwanted content. We recently produced a published report that assessed current technical proposals for detecting unwanted content on these kinds of platforms. And in going through our exercise, what became obvious is that a lot of effort has been placed on developing technical proposals or different kinds of methods for content detection, potentially motivated by platforms and their needs to meet certain obligations. There's other aspect of government agency concerns about these kinds of communication platforms going dark, so to speak. But I think what became evident and is this kind of lack of focus on user perspectives, particularly in terms of the research that's been developed so far. In other words, what options do users themselves want to protect themselves from harm, as well as potentially protect their rights to privacy? And there are many aspects to this, but I think, and this is where this discussion, I hope, is going to help promote that, is this kind of reframing of this narrative around content moderation and encrypted services to one that places more focus on user choice and control as a way of addressing unwanted or abusive content, which is why I think this discussion today is really important. To step back a bit, I mentioned that report that we produced, and it really did, although we did this analysis of different proposals, at the very end, really concluded that there needs to be more focus in terms of design work and research work on improving user agency on these platforms. So I would, in the course of discussion, hopefully bring up some of these unanswered questions, and it would be great to hear what others think in terms of, potential other avenues to address as well. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. It's a lot that we want to cover in this discussion today, but we will do our best to touch on as many of the excellent points you all have raised already. I think to really set the stage, and I think all of you have kind of talked about this a little bit already, but I wonder if folks could give us kind of more of a concrete sense, like, why are people using encrypted services? What are the values or the benefits to them? And, to, I think, Kate's point and Rihanna's point, what are the different values and benefits that we're seeing from different groups and different communities? Kind of open to anybody.
I can jump in. Encrypted services are really important, obviously, for criminalized folks, not just because, the increase in utilization of taking someone's phone when they get arrested, having those kind of just typical state surveillance monitoring is really, really difficult. And especially for folks that trade sex, negotiating and being able to connect to community is essential to harm reduction. So for just a really concrete example, if you meet a new client, the ability to talk with that person, not in physical space, and having some kind of both time and physical distance from that person opened up a lot of opportunities for people. One of the things that was discovered was when Craigslist Adult Services opened up their ads, it was a low barrier way for people to move from physical street-based, bar-based work into you post an ad and all of a sudden you talk to someone beforehand. That means beforehand you were able to all of a sudden negotiate what was happening, establish your boundaries, ask a potential person who doesn't want to share a lot of information, just like basic questions about themselves. And what they found was that because sex workers were able to access harm reduction tools and develop those harm reduction tools, frankly, there was a 20% decrease in female homicides. And that was something that was not just for sex working populations, it was broader than that. And it was because marginalized people were pushed out of physical space, and they were pushed into spaces where they were able to develop these tools. And that's really specific to sex workers. And as oversight, as surveillance has not only increased in terms of government surveillance, but government's really asking private companies to do that level of surveillance, those negotiations are evidence of a crime now. And so in a lot of spaces, when you're talking on different platforms, things like talking about sexual activity and putting a dollar sign in the same message is going to get you blocked and banned. And so there's 1,000 different examples of this, but for folks who are constantly facing this level of surveillance, encrypted communication protects you and offers you an opportunity to do that in a way which isn't going to not only get you banned and blocked, but probably isn't going to show up if you get arrested and they take your phone. And so it's those kind of very tangible pieces that have really made sure that that kind of encryption, and this is true for journalists who are talking to sources, this is true for doctors who are talking to patients, this is true for lawyers who are talking to their clients, where not giving that third party the ability to scan, to immediately block, to hold, and to possess that information is a very tangible form of safety.
I'd like to go past that just a little bit and say that we know that human beings need connections with other people. It's a basic human need. It's even a basic human right. That being alone is something that we all want from time to time. Being forced to be alone is literally torture. Solitary confinement is torture. So when we are in a world where we commonly work with people who are not in the same physical space, we need to be able to create a private space with them using technology. And that's what end-to-end encryption does. It replaces the ability that we would have if we were all in the same room to pull someone off into the corner and whisper in their ear. We all need to be able to do this for many of the reasons that Kate was talking about, but just because people need this. In past discussions about when to use encryption, I would hear sometimes people say, well, I don't really need an encrypted system to be able to talk to my mother. And I disagree. You need it especially to talk to your mother. You need it for the basic things where you can let down your guard, talk as a fully authentic person to another person. And without that, we're always self-monitoring. We're always watching what we're doing. We're not saying what we really want to say. So the need for end-to-end encrypted spaces is a basic human need for everyone. And then also in these other spaces as well, especially.
I would also add that, if we're asking the question, why are people using encrypted services? In a lot of situations, the answer is because everybody else they know is using those encrypted services. People seek out the services that are also where their friends and their family and the people they need to talk to are already on there. And so this is an illustration of why, even if you don't know anything about end-to-end encryption whatsoever, you can nevertheless benefit from the protections that it affords your communications and the integrity and availability of those communications. And it also illustrates why defaults matter so much. When iMessage on iPhone is encrypted end-to-end by default, when WhatsApp for the last 5 years has been end-to-end encrypted by default, and there's talk of moving some of Facebook's other messaging services to being default end-to-end as well, that makes a huge difference just in terms of the baseline level of privacy and security protections that people have without needing to necessarily know anything about it whatsoever. And it changes, I think, hopefully, the norms around what we expect from the services that we use, that once people get used to a service that has particular properties, not least among them network effects of having millions or billions of other people, including all the people they want to talk to on there, I think it can shift what we expect from services in other parts of our lives. And maybe that may be part of what is hopefully driving some of the drive to end encrypt all the things.
Yeah, it's something I was reflecting on Global Encryption Day, that even for myself, as somebody who loves technology, is a dyed-in-the-wool civil libertarian and human rights advocate, works in tech policy, it still takes me someone else asking me to, or switching over to a service that is default end-to-end encrypted to build that into my kind of communications habits, that there's enough of that hurdle sometimes to using the more private, more secure services, that it really can take an extra nudge or a push, but that it is so fundamental to how we communicate. So we've talked a lot about the kind of the importance and the need for access to secure communication technologies, and the kind of the role that they play in so many different ways in people's lives. And then there's also, things aren't all hunky-dory inside communication services or on online communication platforms, right? There's a lot of focus in the press as part of the Facebook files and the Facebook papers in particular, but just kind of consistently now focus on kind of online abuse and what harms can happen because that have a link to online content. And there's a lot of discussion about content moderation issues even just on unencrypted platforms or wholly public facing platforms, and a lot of sort of questioning about what are companies doing, how should they be doing this, what do policymakers want them to be doing more of and taking down more of or taking down less of. But I'm curious from this user perspective, if any of you have thoughts to share on kind of what the current status quo is for content moderation questions from a user perspective or from the perspective of a particular community. In a sort of like, what's working, what things are your communities looking for, or what's not working?
I think that one thing that we need to consider is when something is a public space and when it is a private space. And it's not like there is an easy test for this. You can't use number of people precisely. You can't use other things, but we know. And in public spaces, there are many things that are more acceptable than they are in private spaces. And this is again a fundamental human thing that we know what a private conversation is, even if it's out in public. And figuring out what we do is absolutely informed by the difference between whether or not it is a public conversation or a private conversation. And one of the slogans that we have is scraping is not a crime. If you are in a situation where someone can scrape the conversation, it's definitely a public conversation. But if it is a private conversation, then there should be little to no moderation other than what the participants themselves do. But that's where we need to be describing and building tools for user empowerment in a private space.
I was going to kind of add to that. Essentially, I guess want to just raise the point that a lot of this kind of the moderation or content detection techniques that are applied now are often automated. And there are certain implications for that, particularly from the user's perspective. So these techniques may be aiming and attempting to identify what may be abusive or unwanted content on the platforms, and they could use different kinds of approaches to that. But generally, there are some problems around that. For example, the kinds of data that's used to train these systems, these machine learning systems, how robust they are, their lack of awareness of context, and so on. But also, there's this explainability problem, which often, from the user perspective, we may not be aware or fully understand, or perhaps the platforms themselves may not be able to fully communicate why certain decisions, moderation decisions were made, or why certain detections, or why some content was flagged over other content, right? And that, I think, remains a challenge. And that applies to, whether it's plain text or encrypted systems. It's just this use of these kinds of automated tools that create more difficulty. Yeah, and so that remains a challenge to address.
So now, with the challenges that exist already in kind of how we think about moderation, not including the issue of encryption, now I do want to dig into that piece a little bit more. So and I know in particular, this is something that Dhanaraj and Rihanna have both recently published papers on. So I wonder if especially both of you could give us a little bit of a sense when you're thinking about addressing abusive content, and especially, kind of the sort of content abuse that or abusive content that users want to have addressed. So things like harassment, hate speech, doxing and disclosure of personal information, disinformation that they don't want to see or don't want to interact with. What are your takes on the kind of what sort of moderation is actually possible in end-to-end encrypted systems?
Based on the research that I've done, where I pulled over the spring, I pulled service providers ranging in scale from very small hobbyist sites up to end-to-end encrypted services with billions of users. it seems like there are two tools that in the encrypted spaces can use primarily without having to rely on programmatic access to content. And those are metadata, which has some trade-offs I think are interesting to talk about here, as well as user reporting, which I think comes with its own set of trade-offs as well. What my research found was that when I asked providers what did they find the most useful means for fighting different types of abuse, detecting different types of abuse, even for non-end-to-end encrypted services, overall across the board, user reporting was deemed to be the most useful means of doing abuse detection for the majority of the 12 categories of abuse I asked about, with a couple of exceptions. I do think that comes with trade-offs in terms of, I think we can talk about pushing the burden of content moderation, which can be trauma work, down onto individuals to do the reporting, while also allowing them to be the ones to define within the context of that particular communication whether something is abusive or not, because categories such as hate speech or harassment and so forth can be extremely context dependent. My colleague Alex Stamos likes to say that the most common words preceding the word bitch in comments online are happy birthday. So that may be an instance where it is not harassment at all. But if you were simply to filter everything through a bad words list, you might flag that as being abusive. And so user reporting is still possible within end-to-end encrypted spaces. There are major platforms that allow user reporting within end-to-end encrypted spaces, as well as plenty of academic work showing different designs for doing that. There's been some, I'll just call it misinformation lately, trying to make it appear as though user reporting undermines end-to-end encryption, which is not true. So it does appear to be, at least in the minds of the providers included in my poll, to be a powerful means of doing content moderation, whether or not end-to-end encryption is in play. When it comes to metadata and what types of metadata providers use, I think that's an interesting discussion to have, because there may be incentives for platforms not to collect a whole ton of data about their users and metadata about their users and leverage that in ways that could indicate that something abusive is going on. We have very long-standing usage of metadata to try and detect spammy behavior, for example. And that's something that at this point, if you were paying attention to these areas 20 years ago, there was a lot of worry about the free speech rights of spammers. People don't seem to be as worried about that anymore. And fighting spam is something that is generally considered to be pro-user, at least on the end user, and therefore something that's more universally desirable. But there are definitely trade-offs to be discussed there when it comes to whether having a whole lot of metadata about somebody and about actors and about particular behaviors and particular communications contexts, whether that in itself is privacy intrusive to a degree that may make it less attractive as an option for conducting content moderation.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump in. What was interesting about this and what Rihanna just said is that, so we also I mentioned earlier that we had recently completed a research report on this that essentially looked at different technical proposals and analyzed them to the extent that they actually preserve the privacy guarantees on an end-to-end encrypted platform, but still enable some form of content detection. And what we concluded was that user reporting and metadata analysis were actually the most viable methods. And so it's good to see that based on the survey you did round up on the platform side, they also are pursuing those approaches. So yeah, user reporting, which could include, different forms of maybe reporting buttons, forms, or ways to alert intermediaries that there's unwanted content being detected or received is important. There's an additional proposal, and this has not been implemented widely across platforms, which is message franking, which is a means of authenticating, who sent an actual message on the platform. Also, metadata analysis. So as Rihanna said, this is also an approach that many platforms use. So under certain constraints, under certain with certain caveats, I think this is also a viable approach. Essentially, you're looking at metadata to analyze metadata to detect problematic content, which could be spam or other things like that. But there are certain privacy risks involved in that. In other words, how much metadata should be made available for the platform to conduct this analysis. And a question that we would ask is, to what extent does the user have control in determining that the degree of metadata analysis that's been that's taking place? One recommendation that we made in our report is that ideally, if we place the user in control, so you limit the metadata analysis to the user's device, or ideally to the app on that device, that could be one way of reducing the risk that may come from the platform or others having access to that data. And those risks involve other kinds of privacy risks, maybe de-anonymizing the data or things like that.
Great. Yeah, I want to follow up a little bit on the question of user reporting, right? So it's user reporting has both some of this, documented and empirical evidence about actually being a kind of useful way to solve or address some kinds of abuse. And it's also kind of notoriously known as a very low signal to noise ratio for people doing content moderation, right? It's like for a lot of the folks that I talk to at different online services, they're like, yeah, I mean, user reports, sometimes your user finds the needle in the haystack that you really need to be able to, and you need their skills, their abilities, their cultural context to understand that something problematic is going on. And then 50% of the time, somebody is flagging something as gratuitous violence because they think that means you'll take it down, and it's just an unflattering photo of them. So I'd love to hear kind of more thoughts on what is, if user reporting has some of these really positive characteristics about, it can be user controlled, it's giving the person the agency over deciding, do they expose information in this communication to a third party, the content moderator, or maybe someone else. What are the barriers to that actually solving different problems, like barriers to users being willing to do reports, to the kinds of content they're likely to report? I'm curious, what do you see as kind of the hurdles to user reporting being more useful?
I'll jump in again. I think it depends upon what type of conversation this is. That there are, all systems have things that I'll call texting, by which I mean one-to-one communication or a small number of people. And then there are systems that are more like chat, which are a broader number of people, but it's not the world at large. And this is very different from what we see on our two biggest forms of social media, where on Facebook, for example, my default post there is going to go out to all 500 some of my friends and then all of their friends. So it's not like it is at all public, but it is at least a limited distribution of where that goes. And Twitter, where it is one big space where only selection and editing tools, either that we do ourselves or provided by the system, are what narrow down the space of every communication that's happening to the one thing. In a broad public space, user reporting will tend to have a lot of these other problems with it, where people flag things for that's your opinion, or they have the hidden motive. Whereas in smaller spaces that are a small group of things, user reporting can be extraordinarily effective. I mean, it's like when I get a spam text message telling me that I should click this link to get a free iPhone, I know to report that. There are other things that it's pretty obvious that we know what to report and we're capable of it. That even when we go to some of these other spaces, the most recent Thorn report shows that children as young as 9 know the difference between blocking and reporting. That we know what these differences are, even though it is very hard to describe them sometimes because we don't have rigorous definitions between a real private conversation, a group of people, and on the line. And that is where the modalities of how the conversation is, which could be informed by metadata, show what's appropriate inside that space.
Great. I want to come to Kate on kind of your thoughts on, especially for a more vulnerable population, or indeed a criminalized population, as people who trade sex. What are the kinds of problems that user reporting actually seems like it could solve? And I'm imagining there are also some barriers to wanting to kind of bring in third parties to communications.
Absolutely, and I think you nailed in that framing one of the major tensions. I don't know if I want to say that user reporting is ineffective as much as it is very cost intensive. When we're talking about the difference between user reporting of harm and automation, the assumption is that automation is better, when actually automation is just cheaper, and we don't actually collect metrics about whether or not automation is effective. Is that getting to things that are identified as harm? You can't actually automate harm, because on the surface it's going to look different for everyone. And I think the happy birthday bitch is a very clear example. But if you're talking about who utilizes language that we deem explicit, you're going to probably be talking about people who are trying to reclaim it, and people who are using it in safe spaces and not necessarily weaponizing it. And not to say, obviously, that that's the exclusive use of it, but that is the use of it that is going to be targeted, because not only are you utilizing language, you're probably posting pictures that get flagged. You probably have other accounts, other reasons to get flagged, and all of a sudden you're a high risk account. And then you use a word trying to communicate something explicit, and all of a sudden you are on the chopping block first. And so I think that when we're saying that reporting of harm doesn't work, I think we actually need to dive deeper into that. And what we're saying is the way that we are funding and trying to put effort and energy and capacity towards actually understanding and addressing harm isn't working. And I would say that that's actually because we're not really putting that much into it. I've worked on more than one situation of violence on harm, including trafficking, that has involved major platforms where we have reported things over and over and over again, and reported the same thing over and over and over again, marked it as trafficking, marked it as violence, and didn't even get customer service to respond. And so, and that is not an uncommon thing. That is not something that surprised literally anyone in that situation. And so, yes, you're going to get a lot of those flags. And I think having additional options, as John was just saying, knowing the difference between blocking and reporting, having opportunities to report something in different ways is going to be really important. It also takes a lot of investment. But the other part of that is what you just said, not knowing where this information goes, not knowing who gets flagged is one of the major problems with any marginalized community. Do I want to expose myself even further if I am being victimized, if I think that I can deal with this in a way that leaves me under the radar for whatever platform that I'm sitting on? And that is a very serious question. The fact that we don't actually know what happens to any of this information, don't know where it goes, don't know how it's going to impact us, that is a huge barrier for people who are actually experiencing harm to not report it. But the people who are comfortable outing other people, who are comfortable flagging something, those are the people who are going to be more comfortable doing it. And those are the accounts that are probably going to be flooding your reporting systems that might not actually meet the level or meet the definition of the way that you've identified harm. And so I think that user reporting is a really important piece of it, because people have to be able to identify what is harm. And that comes from having information and then having a safe channel to report it to that is not going to encounter any blowback, and is going to allow you to stay in control of that situation at every step of the way. It's the same reason why I deal with a community who says, I can't call the police, what can we do? And so I think more information, more support, more opportunities, more avenues for user reporting is really important. The challenge on the other side of that is that harm has to occur before we can identify it. And, that just happens, that's just part of the conversation about what are we doing to construct a space and a community? What are the expected values that we are all living into in this way? And that is basic community building. That is basic understandings of the way that we interact with other humans, is trying to figure out how do we craft a space to reduce harm and the potential of harm. And I think that and to not actively be doing that means that you are doing that. You are doing it in a way that is complicit towards marginalization though. And so when we have things like automating explicit content and automating explicit content that we have determined that has all of our biases in it, we know that it puts those biases into the algorithms. We know already that if someone's image is going to be flagged as sexual, they're more likely to be a woman of color. That someone's image is going to be flagged as youth, it's more likely to be an Asian woman. And so when we're looking at these automated assumptions about bias, about it being more productive, what we're actually saying is that it's cheaper and it's easier and it covers our asses in terms of liability, not that it actually addresses harm in any real way. And so I think that the initial step of crafting a space that says, this is what we value, this is what we want to allow on this platform, is the first step. You have to create the conditions where people know what is harm, people know what is not allowed, people know what happens. And then on the other side, having an avenue that is safe for marginalized people, where you know exactly what's going to happen to your information and your data, and your ability to have those conversations and retain that level of safety. I think it's a yes and situation that is going to be really expensive, but I just don't believe that having a profitable company needs to be the central value in the conversation.
And can I two finger on that? I think we're also seeing now the need for some solutions that come from outside of the providers themselves. So there used to be something called Block Together, which was sort of a collectively generated list of accounts or words to mute or to block in order to clean up your social media experience. There's now a project called Block Party for Twitter for now that works in a number of different languages, started by an Asian American woman, that is growing and can, in fact, has like a paid feature of it. I think there's now room for a cottage industry around providers where it is possible to provide tools to empower users to have a better and less harmful online experience in their social media accounts that leverages values that come from outside of the provider itself. And I think that is a trend that we are likely to see continue to grow.
This is all fantastic. And Kate, especially what you were talking about, really making me think about the conversations around trust happen a lot when we talk about end-to-end systems in particular. And what you were saying all just kind of resonated with me as like another dimension of trust that is necessary between users and the service provider in order to enable, actually doing useful user reporting that people are willing to do and willing to kind of stick their neck out a little bit in order to, to engage in that kind of communication. So we have a lot of really great questions from the audience. Thank you all. And one of them is another topic I know we wanted to address. So I'm going to jump to from an anonymous attendee, a question about, so we've been talking about user reporting, but the other big kind of potential useful tool in content moderation and end-to-end systems is metadata analysis. And Rihanna and Dhanaraj in particular have also talked about this a little bit, but question is, how much metadata is just right to support these use cases? Do we need to be careful about metadata bloat or leakage if we continually need more metadata outside the encrypted envelope in order to support more complex use cases for moderation or other kinds of analysis? Maybe a little bit of a leading question, but
I mean, I don't know that there's one answer. I think it may depend on which service you're talking about and what metadata you're trying to collect and how long you keep it for. I think we're finally moving away from the collect it all and figure out what you need it for later world that we used to see from online services, in part because of regulatory interventions, particularly in Europe, that have disincentivized that collect it all mentality. But I think what kinds of metadata you need, how deep and far back it needs to go, and where the just right balance is may depend on what type of abuse you're trying to combat, and the particular context for that particular user. So I don't know that there's one answer that is going to be a one size fits all for every type of service.
I think that another consideration here is the transparency around metadata collection. So actually, we had this conversation recently, I think within CET, we're trying to figure out just who's collecting what kinds of metadata across these platforms, which is not clear. And I think that's a starting point in order for us to, address this question that's raised, a very important question in terms of how much metadata should be collected. You just first need to know what's being collected. But I would also go back to the point I made earlier that if we can place greater emphasis on metadata analysis that's done on the device itself, and so we are removing as much as possible third parties and other service providers from that analysis, that I think would be more beneficial for the user.
I want to say that it's very easy to talk about metadata as something that is distinct from data, and often this is true, but it's very difficult to figure out even what metadata is. There's a paper that I like a lot that is from the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology that talks about the differences between data and metadata within the context of things like phone calls and what data can be collected. And the title of the paper is "It's Too Complicated." And it's 100 pages on what is the difference between metadata and data. And part of the issue is that sometimes data is metadata and sometimes metadata is data. And thus, you can't really come up with a good definition to say, this is what content is and this is what content not is. We could provide different spaces where we would know that within this context, something is metadata. But it's not something that we should fall down the trap of simply saying, there's a difference between metadata and data, and it's okay to collect metadata, because sometimes it's not okay to collect metadata.
Right, and this is also a argument and a debate very familiar from privacy law and kind of surveillance law and government access, and when is something metadata versus when is something kind of protected, more protected by things like a warrant standard for government access to it. There are a couple of other really good questions, including a few from Joe Hall that I might try to kind of combine into one, which is going to Rihanna's, I think, previous point Rihanna had made about kind of the non-platform or non-service provider directed tools, but the potential for other kinds of tools, services created by third parties, things that could help people take more control over their own experiences in an encrypted system, but are made by someone else. So Joe asks about, do we see chat agent-like tools and resources happening that could serve as privacy-preserving, rich moderation tools like your own bouncer or the code of conduct enforcer, or somebody who creates a dick pic filter that you could decide to use on your own communications device. How, in particular, I think one of my questions is, what should we be looking at to see whether those kinds of third-party tools are introducing vulnerabilities into our encrypted communications, creating privacy and security risks, versus are there ways to do it where we're still getting the full benefit, we can have our cake and eat it too, full benefits of encryption, but also a tailored block list or, some kind of filter that helps us do our own screening of the images or messages that are coming over the transom?
This is really a technical question and a good one, because this touches on to some of the things that we've been talking about, particularly the protocols, not platforms discussion. And we really need to have some mechanism where our view into these communications world has a place for us to plug in one of these things, well, actually multiple of these things that we would be able to select on our own. And they could be an entire space of tools made by different communities for what is appropriate, and you would plug them in for your own needs. And that would include things like blocking of pictures, a major domo who decides which connections you're going to accept and which ones you are not. All of these sorts of tools have the need for different sorts of things that meet the needs of different people and different communities of people. So yes, absolutely, this is a thing that we should be asking the providers of these systems to allow one way or another, so that we can put in our own personalized moderation tools.
So we are running short on time. Apologies to the other folks who have asked questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but there is one more that I wanted to pose to folks. Again, I think I know the answer, but to also convert it into your closing thoughts. So an anonymous attendee asks, do we know if end-to-end encryption designers work with marginalized communities who face serious threats in order to troubleshoot, create, learn from them? Should they be doing more? And that would be kind of my question to all of you. Both, is this kind of collaboration and work happening? And if there was something that you could say to person designing an end-to-end encrypted system about how to improve user agency, what are you looking for? What would you ask them to do if you could do it in about 60 seconds?
I think every designer is going to be different. I'm sure there are some out there that, have different communities in mind, are asking, what do you need when they design these things? I think the history of technology has very often been, we just kind of find this new frontier space, and then people who are forced to utilize it go and turn it into something that can be utilized. And digital space is no different than that. I think that for me, the framing of this, and to the other question about, how do you moderate while taking these things into account, you have to bring in the people that you want to center from the outset. And that's not going to be everyone. You can't bring in every single marginalized community. That means nothing. And so what you have to do, though, is from the moment of inception, the decision making has to include and seriously include the needs and the ideas of people who you want to center. And if you want to center venture capitalists, you will bring them in from day one. And I promise that some do. If you want to center sex workers, you bring them in from day one. If you want to center democracy activists, then you bring them in from day one. And so those decisions and those design decisions have the people who need that space most at the core of that work. And in certain ways, it's actually not scalable. And the idea that we can create the singular platform and the singular answer for every corner of the world is just not the way that this works. I really wish that technology and people discussing how we do this, I wish these were more ingrained in just the basic understandings of how we form space and community. Because every time we do that, every time we connect, it does not matter if we are connecting over, Signal or AIM chat or literally walking and knocking on someone's door. The principles are the same, that these are people connecting. And the more people that you bring together, you have to establish what this community is and what this community values. And that's going to be really different based on time and space and who is there. And if we just go back to those principles of saying, what are the communities that we want to create? Who do we want to value in these spaces? And really be honest about our answers about those, I think we would get a lot more of a useful answer. And we're probably not going to get a super easily globalized, easily scalable, and hugely profitable answer, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good thing. And so I think if we just went back to the principles of what does it mean to connect to another people, and who are the people that we want to value and to center, and whose safety and health and rights and what those are and how people define those, if those are actually centered in our conversations of technology as much as they are in our masters in political science, I think we would come to an answer that might be a little difficult sometimes to wrap our heads around. But if we're honest to the values that we are utilizing, I think we're going to get closer to the right answer.
That was brilliant. And we are just about out of time. If other folks on the panel have quick closing thoughts, throw up a hand. But otherwise, I may just send us on towards our wrap up, which is to thank you all for joining. This has been an excellent discussion. The video of this will also be available after the session, so that if folks want to share with colleagues or take another listen, or in my case, write a transcript and start trying to outline some policy papers from all of this, that will be available. Thank you all so much. Big thank you to all of our amazing speakers and to the Stanford Cyber Policy Center for hosting this event online for us. We will certainly be doing more of these sorts of things in the future, so keep an eye out on all of the social media channels where you probably found this invitation. And thank you all once again.
Thank you. Bye.